And now here is our featured presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation brought to you by the Society of Decision Professionals and the Decision Analysis Society, which is entitled Modeling Geographic Preferences for Policy Decisions. I'd like to introduce you to our featured speaker, Jay Simon. Jay is an associate professor in the Kogod School of Business at American University. His main research focus is multi-attribute preference modeling, particularly involving outcomes which occur over time, space, or groups of people. Jay's current and recent work includes preferences over geographical data, altruisms, multi-attribute procurement, cybersecurity investments, and self-sustaining supply chains. He's an associate editor of this journal, Decision Analysis. Jay, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Our moderator for today's presentation is Robin Keller. Robin is a decision analyst and a full professor of operations and decision technologies at the UC Irvine Morash School of Business. She was a 2015 president of Informs and is an Inform Fellow and received the Ramsey Medal in 2015. Her research spans the areas of multiple attribute decision-making, fairness, perceived risk, and planning protection against terrorism, environmental, health, and safety risks. Well, welcome to our Learning Exchange, Robin.
Thank you. Happy to be here from California.
Robin will facilitate your questions throughout the presentation and raise some to our speaker to address live, during, and at the end of the webinar. And now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to our featured speaker, Jay Simon. Jay, you have the floor.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm going to be talking about modeling geographic preferences for policy decisions, and I think without further ado, I'm just going to dive in. I'd like to start by taking couple minutes to just set the stage and tell you a little bit about what this work is based on, a little bit of the history, and then we'll get into some of the meat of it. What I'm going to be talking about is based primarily on work that you can see in a few different sources. Primarily the paper that's on the left of your screen. It's work by Robin, Craig Kirkwood, and myself. We've expanded on that in a few different ways since then. Our work was partly funded by Decision Center for a Desert City, that's at Arizona State, and the link is up there if you're interested. Some of our work also is based on previous work that some researchers there had done. Their focus is primarily on water management, which you can imagine is a big issue in that area. So if you want to see more details or background or anything else in depth beyond what we talk about today, this is where you'd go to check some of those sources out. The way I first got involved in working on this is about 12 years or so ago. We learned of a facility at Arizona State called the Decision Theater. The idea behind the Decision Theater is that they would aid decision makers with customized visualizations for whatever challenges, whatever projects they were working on. So if it was a water management policy decision, they would show them projections of, say, groundwater levels throughout a region or a state that would result from different policy alternatives. For an urban planning problem, they might show maps of temperature, pollution, or housing prices, or crime, or whatever variables were of interest to the people in the room. And the people running this decision theater are very, very good at this. They can create smooth, individualized displays for whatever the problem is. There's one of these facilities now in DC as well, by the way, opened more recently. But what we noticed as decision analysts was that the function of the purpose of this decision theater was to show a lot of detail about outcomes that would result from certain policy alternatives. All right. And as decision analysts, we might see that and not immediately jump to the conclusion that the decision is now easy or solved. Right? It's an enormous amount of information, but that's not the entire story. Right. And decisions using data from geographic information systems, from GIS, are only getting more common. We're getting better at collecting data, storing data, displaying data. So the kinds of problems that would be suited for a decision theater kind of setup, where we could look at detailed maps of outcomes, this is just getting more prevalent. And I bring this up because while I am interested in sharing work that we've done with you today, and we'll be doing that over the next 30, 40 minutes or so, really my primary motivation is to spread the word that these domains are ripe for decision professionals. So having a decision professional in the room when these kinds of problems are being discussed and dealt with is extremely valuable. Right. So why are decisions based on GIS data hard? Many reasons. So here you see two just examples of maps that might be the basis for such decisions. Maricopa County is in Arizona. That's where Phoenix is. One is showing parks and open space. The other one is showing groundwater depletion. Right. One reason these decisions are hard is that there is a lot of information. Every single pixel on one of these maps is information, is telling you something about an attribute level in that location. For all but the simplest problems based on GIS data, you're probably interested in multiple metrics. The decision maker and stakeholders probably care about more than one thing. There may be many locations, and they're probably not identical in terms of features, land usage, and all of that, which means you're going to have to think about trade-offs between places. Right? Impact in one location may not mean the same thing to a decision maker as impact in another location. And like any other multi-attribute decision, we will also have to think about trade-offs between attributes. But trade-offs between places are what's unique about decisions that use GIS data. All right, so many of the other features of these problems, despite often being difficult problems, are not really specific to GIS data, or decisions based on GIS data. But this is where a lot of the unique challenges will arise. And because these outcomes are dispersed over some space, there are often going to be many stakeholders. So people will be affected differently by the results of some of these alternatives. What all of that boils down to is that comparing alternatives is hard. It's a large, complex, challenging decision problem. And our goal when facing these situations is to do our best to make sure that well-established decision analysis methods are used and principles are followed. Right. So that includes things like making sure that we're asking the right questions, that the decision problems are framed correctly. In particular, we're trying to encourage the use of value-focused thinking. So thinking about objectives and what the decision makers care about rather than focusing on the specific policy alternatives that are in front of us to help shape how we're measuring outcomes. All right. What that's going to suggest is we would like to be able to use a value or utility function that captures the relevant aspects of the geographic nature of these decisions. Right. And that means that there's going to be a balance, because of how much information is involved, between adequately capturing the preferences of the decision makers and stakeholders, making sure we're properly incorporating what they care about, but also have some kind of form that is reasonable to assess, something that we have any hope of actually implementing. So ideally, we want stakeholders to be able to evaluate simple trade-offs, and that could be trade-offs between attributes, like how much groundwater would you give up in this region to lower the average temperature by 1 degree, also trade-offs between regions. Right, so how much of a temperature increase would you accept in one region to lower the average temperature in another region by 1 degree? And the idea, the hope is that once we can assess information of that type, that we're able to then compute scores that actually represent preferences, right, for each alternative. Meaning we can take a set of maps of however many different attributes we have for our decision problem, and convert those maps of attribute levels into a value measure that captures preferences. So that if this alternative gets a 0.78 and some other alternative gets a 0.71, that this alternative is more preferable according to the preferences that we've elicited from decision makers.
So Jay, this is Robin.
Yep.
Sorry, Jay, this is Robin. Just going to ask you a question. Why isn't this done more often for decisions that use geographic data?
Why isn't this done more often? Well, a number of reasons. I would say probably the biggest one is that the use of geographic information systems is fragmented, meaning it's not 5 or 10 organizations that implement that work on 90% of these decisions. So it's lots of smaller agencies and organizations, and they probably do not have DA principles typically baked into their processes. And it's, in a sense, it's a reincarnation of a common DA issue, right? That people who could be helped by it may not always be aware of it, and might not realize that there's a gap in the process.
Okay, thanks. We can go on.
Yep. Okay. All right. So in the next section of the webinar, I want to talk a little bit about the model that we have used for this, and very, very briefly the theory that's supporting it. I promise I will not spend a ton of time on this. But I just want to make sure it's clear and unambiguous what we mean by geographic outcomes, preferences, and all of that. Right. So here's a simple example of a geographic outcome, and this is, if you want to see more notation, check those papers. I'm going to try to, outside of a couple of slides, keep this to a minimum. So we have a set of regions that make up the geographic area of interest for this decision. We have a set of attributes. In this simple picture on the slide, there are only 2 attributes. And we have a level for each attribute in each region. So the map on the right side here is showing a geographic outcome. It's very, very common in GIS applications to use simple summary metrics of these outcomes. If you look up examples of decisions using GIS in practice, it's very, very common. There'll be some sophisticated method to produce, to capture, to display the geographic outcomes themselves. But generally, when it comes time to make a decision, evaluate, rank alternatives, that these are consolidated in some way that's not really thoroughly looking at preferences. And there are exceptions to that, but that approach is pretty common. What we mean by geographic preferences is that those summary metrics are not sufficient, that we care about the actual distributions of those attribute levels, meaning increasing it by 1 in one region and decreasing it by 1 somewhere else may change how we feel about that map, or how desirable that map is. Right, so if we do care about the distribution of attribute levels across regions, then we need to use value functions or capture preferences that have that feature to them in some way. So that's just to make clear what we're talking about when we refer to geographic preferences, is that we do care about what attribute levels we see in what regions. Right. Now, if we want to use value functions, just like in any other traditional application of these concepts, there are a few common sense conditions that have to be met, and I am not going to talk about these individually. This is just classical decision theory stuff. But they do rule out some appealing approaches for people who are not used to implementing hard decision or to facing hard decision problems. So it rules out something like lexicographic ordering, where you say, first I'm going to look at region 1 and I'll use that as the basis for the decision. If it's a tie, then I'll move on to region 2. That can't be captured with a value function. Voting methods also will not, voting methods will violate these. So that's if you have 5 stakeholder groups, taking a poll of which alternative they want might sound appealing to some people facing these problems. Not consistent with some of these conditions. All right, and again, those are just the technical, theoretical stuff that we need to justify using a value function at all. What we're more interested in are the conditions that let us use a practical form of a value function that we could actually assess. Right? We don't want just any value functions. We want something that we've got a realistic hope of implementing. So there are 2 more conditions that will get us all the way there. The first one is preferential independence, which is the same idea as preferential independence in any multi-attribute decision. The idea is just that if you have 2 alternatives and they only differ on a subset of the attributes, or in this case, in a subset of the regions, that is, their attribute levels are the same in all of the other regions. The idea behind preferential independence is you can focus only on the regions in which they differ, or the attributes on which they differ. You don't have to look. You don't have to worry about what all of the common levels are between the alternatives. There aren't any more complex kinds of interactions between them. So an example of how that might be violated, and I'm going to look at specifically the between regions type, since that's the one that's unique to these kinds of decisions. If you have 2 parks in a town and you're looking at differences between alternatives that involve one of the 2 parks, you might care how usable the other park is when determining how good or bad you want the outcome to be in the region that contains the other park. Right, making sure that people have at least one park that they're able to use. So issues like that can come up, but in general, it's just precluding more complex types of interactions between attributes or between regions. Right, and if the decision makers are okay with or have preferences that are reasonably approximated, reasonably meet this condition, what that will lead to is an additive form for the value function, which makes assessment a lot easier. And we can make assessment still easier with another condition called homogeneity. The idea behind homogeneity is that the trade-offs you're willing to make in one region are the same as trade-offs you're willing to make in another region. So if you say that in region 1 you'd prefer having a temperature of 90 degrees and an air quality index of 40 to a temperature of 80 degrees and an air quality index of 60, that you would have that same preference for any single region. Right. Homogeneity might be violated if you have regions that are just functionally very different from one another. So for instance, if one region is a city and the other region is wilderness, then this might not apply. You might be willing to make different trade-offs for the city region versus the wilderness region. And if these conditions are violated, that certainly doesn't mean that you can't develop a value function, assess it, and implement it for this problem. It just means that the form of the value function is going to be a little more complicated and you'll have to do a little bit more assessment. So for the homogeneity condition, you might have to assess trade-offs separately for the city regions and the wilderness region. If all these conditions are met, this is what the geographic value function looks like. If you've worked with multi-attribute preferences before, this may look pretty familiar. The only real difference is that we have a region weight as well. Right? So we need a set of weights for the regions, we need a set of weights for the attributes, and we need a single region, single attribute value function for each attribute. Right? So we'd have a single attribute value function for groundwater level or park area or pollution level or temperature, whatever attributes we're interested in, and that value function would have the same shape in every region. If homogeneity is violated, then we would need to assess multiple single attribute value functions for each attribute. Right? And I'm only showing the simplest case here. That in this case, we have these three parameters that we need that need to be assessed. If you want the value functions to capture more detailed aspects of preferences, so for instance, if you want to apply them to gambles where the distribution of outcomes is uncertain, there are other conditions you can use that will allow you to do that. I'm not going to go into that, but a couple of the references that I will give you at the end deal more with that. We're just looking at these basic forms of value functions.
Jay,
now,
let me cut in again, Jay.
Okay,
just
go
a
ahead.
couple of questions. So one question was on slide 7, you showed a number of different maps, and you said you were going to evaluate alternatives, and one score was 0.78. And then you orally said, well, maybe another score, a different alternative, might get a score of 0.71. So a question is, how does the decision maker relate to those numbers? What are the units? And then a related question that's come in from the audience is, what would be the suggested way to present the results from the study? You know, what's a very transparent way to present your results to the decision maker? And you may leave some of it to the end, but I just thought I'd give you the questions now.
Okay, let me say a little bit about it now, and maybe later on some of the rest of it will be answered. If not, I can try to do this more thoroughly at the end. So first of all, this is a value measure. It's just on a 0 to 1 scale, where 0 is the worst allowable alternative that could come out of this process, and 1 is the ideal alternative. It's not on a natural scale. I will say that I understand that it's a little bit of a black box now because these are just abstract maps and a number. And in a real decision process, the people in the room would have a sense of what each of these maps actually represents, and they'll have gone through the assessment process. So they'll know what the single attribute value functions look like. They'll have answered hopefully some trade-off questions, so they have a sense of weights of different region, and they'll be shown some intermediate results, so that they're not just seeing the beginning and the end. This is just intended as what we're starting, but this picture is just intended to show where we're starting and where we want to end up. But certainly a lot more would be shown to decision makers than this.
Yeah, so for example, in California, we have a grading scheme that's used for grading the water, ocean water health and quality. So, you know, they'd say this beach is an A and this is a C. So that would be an example of translating a numerical scale to some way that might be more useful. And that's all for now. You can go on, Jay.
Okay, thanks. All right, thanks. We were right here. All right. Now, once we've established that this kind of value function is okay to use for this problem, the next step is going to be to elicit these preferences from decision makers. And most of this is not any different from what would be done in any other application of multi-attribute decision making. So the same methods that work for assessing single attribute value functions would be just fine here. Things like mid-value splitting, where you take an interval of attribute levels and assess at what point in that interval half of the total value gain for that interval is achieved. You can fit value. You can fit the value function to some particular form that has whatever desirable characteristics or characteristics that are reasonable for that attribute for that decision maker. Attribute weights, same thing. The methods in any other multi-attribute approach are still going to work here. You can do things like value trade-off methods, where I sort of hinted at this earlier, but where you ask decision makers simple questions about how much they're willing to sacrifice in one region to achieve say a perfect attribute level in another region, or I'm sorry, on another attribute, not region. You can also use swing weights, where you assess how much the extent to which decision makers would like to swing various attribute levels from their worst to their best level. So again, these are not unique to GIS decision problems. The challenge that is unique to these kinds of problems is, in terms of elicitation, is the region weights. So first, the same methods that we use for any other weight elicitation, these same methods are still valid. They just practically might be very hard to implement because the number of regions might be extremely large. Right? If you have 1,000 regions in each map, you're probably not going to ask detailed trade-off questions between example maps and try to solve for a set of 1,000 weights. Right? That's just not feasible, unless you have a whole lot of time with the decision makers. Right? So in general, we're probably going to have to rely on some kinds of approximation methods. I'm going to talk more about this toward the end. I guess I'll go into as much or as little detail on it as I can, time permitting, but I will say that this is an ongoing challenge. I don't think that this is a nut that has been completely cracked yet. Right. So what I want to do next is talk a little bit more about our main example, to which we've applied a lot of this work. Right. It's called a LUMPS model. That's Local Scale Urban Meteorological Parameterization Scheme. I'll tell you in a minute what that actually means, in terms that are a little more understandable to more people. But I want to state up front that what we're working on here is not one specific decision. Rather, we're interested in how we can layer preference information on top of a sophisticated GIS model to support a whole range of decisions. Right? So I'm going to start with the model itself. This is a LUMPS model implemented by DC, Decision Center for Desert City Researchers, specifically for Phoenix. It's what we mean by a LUMPS model is really a heat flux model. So it's a sophisticated model that looks at how heat is absorbed and flows throughout a city. Phoenix, and many other cities as well, has an ongoing challenge with what are called urban heat islands, meaning it's a lot hotter in the city than in the area immediately surrounding the city, mostly due to surfaces that absorb a lot of heat, more than the native soil or plant cover would. So something like asphalt absorbs a lot more heat than whatever would be there naturally. The biggest differences are observed at night, and when I say that it's hotter in the city than the surrounding area, I'm talking about differences of, say, 10 degrees at night. And in Phoenix in the summer, where it's already extremely hot, that's a serious problem for a number of reasons. It's not pedestrian friendly. It leads to an increase in health problems, water usage. There's a whole range of reasons that they would like to mitigate this effect. The easiest way to get around it, to address that problem, is by planting non-native vegetation in the city, which tends to absorb a lot less heat during the day and therefore release a lot less heat at night. So that increases the amount of night cooling that happens. Unfortunately, that requires a lot of water. So the lumps model will also capture the fact that while that does reduce temperature, it also increases the evaporation rate, so how much water is lost to becoming water vapor. The details of how this heat flux model work are complicated. It's affected by the city layout in some non-obvious ways. I think for most of us, myself included, it's largely a black box model. It's very, very detailed. Each pixel in the model is 2.5 meters wide, so it's very fine-tuned. It's very granular. But the results do tend to be consistent with the macro level common sense sorts of effects that a non-thermodynamics expert like me can still appreciate. So things like adding more reflective surfaces and less asphalt is going to lead to a lot less heat. Right. And DC-DC was using this lumps model to evaluate the impacts of different development strategies. And in particular, for this example, we're looking at 10 different tracts, so 10 regions in our geographic decision problem. And you can see exactly where they are if you know the Phoenix area in that map. They're color-coded by neighborhood type. Mafic just means that it's irrigated vegetation in a residential neighborhood, so things like lawns. Xeric refers to desert soil and native vegetation. Right. So the objectives, starting with value-focused thinking, the objectives in this decision problem, upon conferring with experts on this problem, is that, as I mentioned, they want to maximize the amount of night cooling that happens as a result of whatever development they do, and they want to minimize evaporation rate, so loss of water. I'm going to skip the details of exactly how these are measured in the interest of time. Right. But the key idea is that they tend to conflict. So strategies that increase night cooling tend also to increase evaporation rate. But it's not a perfect exchange rate. It depends on a lot of factors, and the effect is going to be different for each tract. And that's why the lumps model is useful. Right. And they considered 3 representative development strategies listed out here. One is called Oasis, one's called Desert, one is called Compact. And again, I'm going to not go into all the fine details of exactly what each of these involves, but there are 3 different strategies for addressing one or both of those issues. And the lumps model will show the impact of each of the 3 development strategies in each of the 10 tracts. Right. Now, the preference information that we need to capture before we can implement the decision problem here for this example approach. Well, first we need to know what the single attribute value functions look like for night cooling and evaporation rate. We used simple value functions and weights just based on input and conversations with DC-DC researchers. So the value functions are in exponential form. Essentially, what we're just trying to do here is capture the extent to the degree to which they showed diminishing returns, but no finer details about what happens at finer, more narrow portions of the scale of any of these attributes. Okay, just a general pattern of diminishing returns. So how linear, convex, concave these functions are. and they also felt that night cooling was the motivation for this problem, but they're also rather concerned with water usage. They put a slightly higher weight on night cooling. Right. So with this information and the projected impacts from the lumps model for each of the 3 strategies and each of the 10 tracts, the individually optimal strategies for each of the 10 tracts is shown here. So it's mostly compact, meaning increasing the building coverage, a couple of oasis, and 1 desert. So oasis is the one that involves non-native vegetation that requires irrigation. Right. But this becomes more interesting when policy concerns warrant some coordination and some planning. So an example of how that might be implemented, how that might take shape, is if there's a directive to decrease evaporation rates by some certain amount, or increase night cooling by some certain amount. So if we have a restriction that we want evaporation rate to decrease by at least 5% overall and night cooling to increase by at least 5% overall, here's what that would lead to. If we were to assign equal weights to each of the regions, this is the set of strategies of development strategies we would get. It looks a little bit different from the individually optimal ones. There's the oasis strategy isn't used at all, mostly because that boosts the evaporation rate quite a bit. But of course, we don't necessarily know that the weights are going to be considered equal by the decision makers for this overall strategy. So for instance, if the central Phoenix weights were twice the weights of the other regions, and I've just sort of tried to indicate which regions are actually in central Phoenix. I don't know if there's an official boundary. I'm sure people who know Phoenix better than I do might dispute something there. But roughly, those are the ones that are in central Phoenix. And what happens here is one of the central Phoenix tracts becomes switches to oasis. So there's going to be more non-native vegetation there. And to make up for that use of evaporation rate, a couple of the other tracts switch from compact development with additional buildings to desert with more native soil and native plant cover. Right. This is just one example. You could come up with any sorts of optimizations, constraints on overall levels, and really whatever other policy restrictions might be relevant for that specific development challenge. Again, I'm just really trying to highlight how the preference pieces of this can overlay, can interact with the physical model, the lumps model, for how all of this information is generated in a geographic information system. And like any other major decision, you probably also want to do some sensitivity analysis once you've come to a result, and make sure that whatever you're choosing is more or less robust to possible changes in parameters. I highlight it in particular for geographic decisions because of the fact that outcomes are dispersed and tend to affect a variety of stakeholders. All right, so you generally want to make sure that a very, very small change in a parameter isn't going to lead to a very, very different decision that some of the stakeholders may feel very differently about. Right. So that's just a,
Jay, I just wanted to
quick
point
overview.
out that the bottom of the slides are a little bit cut off. So basically at the bottom,
Okay.
just pointing out that those are your original weights of night cooling 0.6 and evaporation rate 0.4. It just doesn't show on our screens.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, if it's not showing up, there's also a slider for the night cooling and evaporation rate weights. And I apologize if anything else has been cut off. I didn't realize that the bottom of my slides were not showing. So, So Robin, if you noticed anything else in earlier slides that was key that wasn't showing up, definitely please feel free to chime in with that.
Yeah, we could sort of read most of them. That's fine.
Okay, good to know. All right, I want to now, we only have a little bit of time left, just quickly point out two nice recent uses of geographic preferences to these kinds of decision problems. Both happen to be from Finland. There's a strong, I think, a strong DA presence in Finland. The first one was a forest management example where they were trying to balance logging with all of the benefits of having forests, and looking at different strategies based on their impacts 30 years in the future. And they used a slightly different method than what I went through, so they don't explicitly use region weights, but they built so many different, they included so many different summary metrics that incorporate the same kinds of aspects of geographic preferences that I'm quite confident that had they set it up in this way, their results probably would have been pretty similar. They have something like 10 or 15 summary metrics like the ones listed here, right, that are capturing for any given location reasons why you might assign it a higher or a lower region weight. Right. Another example, this is a very recent work as part of some exploration of what you can do with incomplete geographic preferences. An example that had to do with air defense, and this one used a relatively small number of regions. So what they did to approximate preferences to get an incomplete picture of trade-offs that decision makers were willing to make, they had them rank the regions in terms of importance from most to least, and use that ranking as bounds on what the set of weights could have been. All right. So as I hinted at earlier, I do want to spend the last couple minutes just going over a little bit more about how you elicitate region weights, what some of the approaches are, why this is difficult. And again, this is the assessment challenge that's unique to these kinds of decisions. Main issue is that the number of weights might be enormous. You might have 500 or 1,000 regions, which is going to preclude using a lot of the more common methods. All right. So the idea is we want to make the elicitation of region weights as easy as possible. If we're asking trade-off questions, we should be using simple maps. So don't do that. The trade-off questions should be based off of maps that are much, much easier to process, require less cognitive load on a decision maker, and can be done a lot more quickly. Right. If we're not going to go through this whole process, then we have to use some kinds of approximation methods. One approach that I'm currently working on is what I call a tier-based approximation, where a decision maker just does a very, very simple rating or classification for each of the regions, like high, medium, or low, and that those are converted to a set of weights in a way that is similar to the way weight approximations based on rankings work, but unfortunately rank-based methods don't work very well when you have 500 or 1,000 regions. And the next two of these were done by the two recent papers or analyses that I just mentioned. One is eliciting incomplete preferences. So you could ask a few specific questions. Well, that analysis didn't use trade-off questions, but you could ask a few specific trade-off questions if you know what the crucial aspects of preferences are. So if you know what regions or what attributes are really the drivers of this decision, you could focus more on those and not worry about two empty tracts at the edge of the map that you know nobody's going to care very much about. All right, and if you don't have a lot of alternatives to choose from, it's possible that you may already have your answer without going through the entire process. Another approach is to use natural measures like the area of the region, how many people live there, et cetera, as proxies. And that's what the forest management analysis did. But I would add here that if it's really easy to do this, if you find that just like multiplying the attribute level by the population or by the area captures how you feel about how relevant each one of these regions is, then you probably don't really have geographic preferences. So what I'm referring to is where you have to use maybe qualitatively to some degree a combination of several of these factors just to give you a sense of how critical or not critical a region is. So proxies is the key word here. So just to wrap up briefly here, this is an opportunity for decision professionals. It's a modern issue. It's grown a lot in the past 10 or 15 years, and it's only going to keep growing as we get more and better capability for dealing with geographic data. So collecting it, organizing it, displaying it. And DA approaches in general apply to these decisions. I didn't really talk about most of these in depth. I tried to focus on the ones that are different for these kinds of decision problems. But all of these concepts are still relevant. And the idea, the reason that we went through this urban development example with the lumps model was to underscore that what we want to do is take these sophisticated physical models that estimate what maps will look like, the projected distribution of attribute levels that result from alternatives. We want to be able to integrate that with a preference model, something that can, in a structured, organized way, allow us to compare one set of maps to another set of maps. Right. And I'm going to leave this up for 10 or 15 seconds, just in case anybody had a particular paper or reference or anything that they wanted to look at. This is where that print screen button might come in handy. And then once I take this off, we can move on to Q&A. Okay, I think we've got a few minutes left. So first, I will say thank you to everybody who attended, and hope that this was informative and useful, and that you got something out of it. And I think I will turn it over to Robin and see what kinds of questions we have.
Okay, thank you, Jay, and thank you on behalf of the Society of Decision Professionals and the Decision Analysis Society of Informs. The latest question that just showed up was, congratulations to Jay for a very clear and interesting presentation. Let me give you a little bit harder thing to respond to. It's hard to get time with decision makers, and the subject matter experts may not have preferences that match the decision makers' preferences. So for such large amounts of data with these GIS problems, what would be your response on how to deal with that? It could also relate to possibly having a decision support system built in, or maybe doing a model that is not as elaborate as you described. Okay,
so I think there are a couple different answers to different parts of that. So I will say that in terms of decision makers or stakeholders' time, that absolutely, I mean, that's a concern for a lot of big decisions, but here in particular, when we have a lot of data and preferences are complicated, approximation techniques are very helpful. Survey techniques are very helpful. Even just doing a basic stakeholder analysis might be useful, where we try to understand for different types of stakeholders, in general, where there's agreement, where trade-offs or compromise might be necessary. In terms of, let me make sure I get to each piece of this. In terms of building some kind of decision support system into these sorts of GIS models, so I can't personally do that, at least not a professional level one. You'd need a better programmer than me for that. But there have been individual instances of people doing that. One of the people referenced on this last slide, Malchevsky, has had work a few years ago where he was layering geographic constraints on Google Maps interface for siting decisions, where users could go in and check off what geographic aspects of locations were important to them or not important to them. And I think it imposed constraints on where they were allowed to build new facilities. The challenge with integrating those kinds of systems into GIS models is as I mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of this work is fragmented, that it's not a couple of large organizations doing all of this, that it's often local, regional agencies, and their decision problems and their GIS applications may be unique to them. So it's hard to build a one-size-fits-all sort of system, something that's more broadly useful. I will say, though, that ArcGIS, probably the most popular GIS software out there, does have APIs, so presumably a skilled programmer could do it. So I'm just throwing that out there. Did I address all of that? I'm worried I might have missed something.
Yeah, I think that was great. And Malchevsky is on the bottom line of your slide, so I couldn't see it, but the slides will be made available later.
Sorry, just to be clear, it's not that paper. It's different work that he did later.
Okay. Okay, well, I think that's about it for now. So again, thanking you on behalf of SDP and DAS. Back to you, Brig.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's Learning Exchange. I'd like to thank our presenters, Jay and Robin, our guests and attendees for their time and contributions to today's event, especially during this very busy time of the year. I'd like to remind you that you may find the replay of this webinar on the SDP website at decisionprofessionals.com. Now, from all of us at SDP and DAS, we wish you happy holidays and a great start into 2020. Make it a great one. Thanks, and you may now disconnect.